Okay, I think we're going to get started. I'm recording for my father who really wanted to listen in, but it's 3 a.m. in Zichron Yaakov right now. So he loves me, but not that much. So I thought we would get started by doing a little bit of an introduction. It's an intimate crowd here, and I try over Zoom to bridge space. So I'll invite everyone to just introduce themselves. And as the topic for tonight is fruit trees in Sharon and how Orlah applies to it, I'd like to ask you if you have any fruit trees in your backyard here, and what kind, how are they doing? And if you don't have any fruit trees and you are aspiring, then what fruit trees would you plant? And I'll just share personally first that we moved into our new house about 5 years ago and planted 2 pear trees, an apple tree, 2 plum, and a peach tree. And they're all have had varying levels of success, but our plum trees are doing the best. And they actually produced fruit this year, which was only their second year after being replanted. So we had actual Orlah here in Sharon. And as I was leaving the house tonight, I told Adina, she had asked, what topic are you teaching on? I said, teaching about Orlah. She said, well, in Sharon, that's actually relevant. How many rabbis in Teaneck could say that? So I appreciated that appreciation. And I don't know why Teaneck always gets made fun of, but here in Sharon, we are more connected to the land than many other Jewish communities, or at least Orthodox communities are. And so issues of Orlah are actually relevant, which is a beautiful thing. So I just introduced myself a bit through my fruit trees, and I'll just invite, maybe I'll call you so it's not awkward with the pausing and everything, to just introduce yourself and share your fruit trees or what you aspire to plant someday. David, can I call on you first?
Sure, glad to. I love gardening, and I think I know how to vegetable garden, maybe. I'm a miserable fruit tree gardener, apparently. I have lots of attempts, and none of them as of yet are successful, but they're newer than yours, Rabbi Chessis. So I planted a peach tree, and it's quite sad. I think it might barely be alive. And then that's my oldest, maybe 2 years old. And then I planted some apple trees, cherry, nectarine, and a cold hardy pomegranate, believe it or not. So I'm trying.
Wow.
And then some blackberry and raspberry bushes. So I don't know if we'll get into the bushes around fruits. But yeah, trying all of that, and we'll see if any of it works. I don't know. I'm not sure what my success rate is going to be, but I'm willing to give it a try.
Fantastic. A lot of gardening and fruit growing is the art of the exercise of hope, of doing our best and realizing that a lot is out of our control. Okay, Mark, you're up next on my screen.
I first have to unmute because I didn't want the background noise to enter the conversation. But basically, as you know, I've been doing some gardening, and mostly vegetables. I did plant some blueberries this year, and I have to rejuvenate my raspberry, and I planted a blackberry. So that's one question: is what the status of the various berries? I did plant strawberries. I'm fairly confident. Well, I'm going to guess that they don't count for Orlah. I did contemplate planting some like an apple or a peach, but at least right now I'm not going to do it because I don't want the trees to take up so much of what's left of my sunny space in my front yard. Also, I frankly don't think I have the bandwidth to deal with a crop that comes all in at once. Yeah. Like I thought, like the gold feathers on the next block, they were calling people over saying our peaches are ripe, now our apples are ripe. And what I like about the vegetables, they come in over time, and I pick them as I need them. I am thinking for next year, though, to plant a grapevine in
cool.
that arbor that I now have the morning glories. So that's
Uh-huh.
something I was thinking about. And or I'm still open to other possible fruit trees that would still stay small and not take up a lot of space. When we were visiting Aton now a week and a half ago, there's a spot where they have, it was started as an agriculture school. That's this program is science and soil science, but they had like a garden area near the commons, and I was surprised there was a fig tree. And I said, oh, maybe they're like the cold-hardy pomegranate and cold-hardy fig tree. Now, unfortunately, all the figs were just starting to be of the right size. So I'm saying, even so, it doesn't seem like these figs are going to make it past the frost. But I'm open to ideas that may work in the garden that definitely come under the fruit category.
That's fun. Well, it sounds like you have a lot of experiments already in motion and hoping to expand that. And I forgot to mention that I also have a fig tree. So I right now it's just in a pot, a large pot, but I became friendly with Jim from American Landscape down on South Main, and he asked for a lesson on some agricultural laws in the Bible, and in exchange he gave me some plants like a fig tree, a small little fig tree. So I was thinking of inviting him tonight, but I thought it would be a little bit of a distraction because he knows so much, and he would take up all of the space just answering our questions about how to grow our fruit trees. But maybe another time we'll arrange for some shul time with him. But anyways, I'll let you know how the fig tree goes. It's just the second year, so it's still very small, but we'll see if we can make it flower and fruit.
That'd be fantastic. I did follow your advice, and I did manage to start rooting the aravot.
Oh, great.
But the leaves seem a little dry, so I don't know if it's going to, I see the roots, but I don't know if there's enough vitality left in the rest of the twig to make it, but we'll see. They're sitting in
usually
the
leaves will fall off, but the roots will still grow.
Oh, okay.
So that's been my experience. And now as I guided the Stryer kids through it, they have an Arava forest.
Nice.
And they grew 3 years later. They have dozens, if not hundreds, of Arava branches growing. So it's really beautiful for them to see. We went out and picked this year on Erev Sukkot, and it was really special. Okay, let's go to Hannah.
Okay, so what do I have? I have a very old Concord grapevine that was here when I arrived, and that produces some fruit every year, which I enjoy. I have a blueberry bush. I took out my raspberry bushes; those weren't doing well. And I do have, David, you reminded me that I planted some. I tried to plant some pomegranate seeds with my students, and it didn't seem to be growing, so I put it aside, and a few weeks later I looked and it was actually growing. So now this is the second year, and it's about, I have two, one's about, I don't know, 7 inches high, the other one maybe 10 inches high. And what happens is the first year I remember looking and like all the leaves were drying up, and I thought, something, I think it goes dormant. So I stuck it in the basement and I watered it every few weeks, and sure enough, in the spring it grew again. So I have this pomegranate tree that I'm not sure what I'm going to do with, but so far it's alive.
That's great.
Fantastic. You'll have to compare notes. Okay, thank you. Aaron, you're up.
So we don't have any fruit trees. I would love to have avocado and mango, but I don't think it's going to work out in the
You're gonna
Sharon.
have to go back to your homeland in Israel,
so.
your birthplace.
But I was interested in this subject. That's why I'm actually traveling in the West Coast. I'm actually watching you from Reno, Nevada.
Oh, wow.
I'm here, so I'm just interested in the subject.
Okay. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you for joining from so far away. One of the COVID bonuses is our learning is now accessible wherever you are.
Thanks to Zoom.
Indeed. Okay. Harvey, if you're there, or Naomi, if you're there, you're welcome to introduce yourself through any fruit trees that you.
So okay, I'm too creaky to garden. But as with Aaron, the topic sounded interesting because I'd seen other references lately, and I hadn't realized that Orlah applied outside of Israel. So I'm curious as to, what the difference is here, and whether it applies to anything that takes Ha'et's blessing, which apparently is a larger category than one might think, because it's only everything's either Adamah or Eitz for fruit. So it doesn't always seem to be completely consistent.
Yep. So we're going to talk about that, and that question of Orlah applying even outside of Israel is going to be the crux of our part 1 this week. And next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of how to calculate Orlah. It's quite complex in terms of the different Rosh Hashanahs for saplings and for trees. So we're going to talk about that next week. But this week, we're going to focus on that very question, which is most people don't realize that Orlah applies even outside of Israel. So we're going to understand the nature of the mitzvah and why it is that even though it's dependent on land, it still applies outside the land of Israel. So you tuned in for the right reasons. And Michelle, I'm not sure if you were here for the prompt, but you probably figured it out. Everyone is sort of just credentialing through either their fruit trees or their fruit tree aspirations or just their interest in the topic. Oop, I think you're still muted.
Sorry,
Go
yep.
ahead.
I have no credentials. If anyone has walked by our house recently, you'll notice that we are doing a massive addition, and between replacing the septic and them having to access the gas line and the water line and do all the siding, whatever, pretty much any landscaping that used to exist does not exist anymore, has been pulled out and trampled. So we're kind of starting from scratch in the spring. So this was just perfect timing for me to start thinking about, what we're going to plant and what it's going to mean.
Fantastic. Well, you'll hopefully get some ideas, and you might have heard already who to go to for questions. And happy to have a new fruit growing member of the community. So we'll all learn from each other's experiences. Wonderful. So thank you all for introducing and sharing why you showed up. Iran and Esther, I don't think I got to you yet.
We do not have any fruit trees, but we do like to eat.
Okay, that's a fantastic reason to show up because fruit tastes good, and you can run into fruit buying issues in Chutz La'aretz if Orlah applies. So definitely a good reason.
How do you find out?
So we'll talk a bit about what to do when you see the produce of Israel being sold in a fruit store. But I'll say just from the onset that Orlah in Chutz La'aretz is not going to be an issue for fruit that is grown in Chutz La'aretz, because we are more lenient when it comes to the probability of fruit being Orlah in Chutz La'aretz. And we would presume that the overwhelming majority of fruit that lands in a fruit store is going to be produced or owned by a non-Jew, and Orlah would not apply in that situation. So we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through some of the Mekorot. But when you go to Ward's Berry Farm, it's not going to be an issue of Orlah unless you see fruit from Israel, which then it potentially could be, because we would be more stringent in Israel fruit that is possibly of Orlah origin, we would be more machmir, more stringent about. So let's start from the beginning. I'm going to share screen and pull up a source sheet that will introduce us to the pasuk or the psukim from which this entire topic springs forth. And as I'm pulling this up, I'm happy to say that no trees were killed in the process of making this source sheet because it's all digital. So very exciting and in tune with our topic tonight. So I'm going to skip the first source for now. Maybe we'll come back to it next week. But I want to begin with the origin of Orlah in Parshat Kedoshim. In source number 4 here, we read as follows. V'chi tavo'u el haaretz, when you come to the land, unitatem kol eitz ma'achal, and you plant any fruit-bearing tree, v'arlatem orlato et piryo, then you should consider its fruit to be Orlah. And here the word Orlah is repeated twice. Is it just for emphasis, or does it have any kind of legal ramification? And we will soon see that the rabbis, of course, extrapolate halachic significance from this repetition, that the Orlah is really Orlah. And what that means is that it's not just prohibited from eating, but it's also prohibited from benefiting from, meaning that there is an isur hana'ah, in the same way that we can't sell or smell basar b'chalav, meat cooked with milk. So too, Orlah has that classification of being asur b'hana. So if you have the Orlah fruit, let's say you use it to burn a fire that you cook something with, the stuff that you cook is going to be prohibited as an extension of that Orlah. So the Gemara talks about bread that was baked in an oven that used peels of Orlah and for the fuel, and that bread was considered to be prohibited.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
When you're talking about Orlah, this is just the fruit, though, not the leaves or the stems or those anything else. Is that right?
Correct. So here we see the pasuk says et piryo, just the fruit, to the exclusion of all the other parts of the tree. So the wood or the leaves are not subject to the prohibition of Orlah. It is just the fruit and the what's called the peels, the shomer hapri, the protective parts of the fruit are also included in the pri itself. Indeed, that is the case. So we've seen so far in the pasuk that v'chi tavo'u el haaretz, which seems to indicate that where is this mitzvah applicable?
In Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah, only in Eretz Yisrael, right? V'chi tavo'u el haaretz is a preface that is given to many of the mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz, the commandments that depend and are hinged to the settlement of the land. And so it has the same introduction as other categories of mitzvot, like Shemitah that we are in right now. We're in a Shemitah year, and it's only applicable in Eretz Yisrael. And Ma'asrot and Trumot, the system of separating tithes to give to the priests and to the Levites, that's also only pertinent to things that grow in Eretz Yisrael. So the introduction to this mitzvah seems to give it the classification of something that would only be relevant in Eretz Yisrael. And we see that it's only an eitz ma'achal, so any kind of tree that does not produce fruit isn't going to be relevant. And then we saw this va'arlatem orlato, which sort of is a double layer of orla, indicating that it's not just prohibited to eat, but also to benefit from. And we saw also et pirio, that it's specifically just the fruit and not other parts. And how long does this prohibition last? Shalosh shanim yihye lachem arelim lo ye'achel. For 3 years, one has to consider the fruit to be orla, and the prohibition is to eat it. So just to clarify a little bit about this term, orla, what does orla mean? We've been using it, but not really defining it. So Rashi says on this pasuk, va'arlatem orlato, va'atamtem atimato. So this is in source 5 here, where it's you shall close its closing. You shall keep it enclosed. That's what the word atum means, like to seal off. And yehe atum v'nistam. Nistam means to block off. Milahanot meimenu. So Rashi already gives us that there are 2 levels of prohibition here. We're meant to seal off the eating and block off the enjoyment. Okay, so he's alluding to that double. He's both defining the term orla and describing the double-layered prohibition of eating and enjoying. But we would probably recognize this term arel from many other usages in Tanakh, like arel sfatayim. Moshe's lips are sealed; he has trouble speaking. Aral oznaim, the Nevi'im, the prophets, accuse the people of having closed or blocked ears as they are unable to really listen and internalize their, moralistic messages. We have also aral levavchem. Moshe says that your hearts have been sort of covered and blocked from really doing tshuva. And then, of course, we also have the orla, which is mentioned with regard to the covering that's removed during the Brit Milah. So in the context of fruit, at least, there is a blocking from eating and from benefiting from. And that's what the term orla means. It fits into a whole array of other usages of things that are blocked or sealed. And so that sort of situates it as a word within other instances in Tanakh. So we have looked at this original pasuk, and we've seen a little bit about the scope of the mitzvah. One other point that I'll mention here, I forgot to say, but it's already been referenced, so I'll add it now, is it says kol eitz ma'achal, that this is specifically referring to a tree, something which is subject to a borei peri ha'etz. As Harvey mentioned earlier, there are different ways to understand the category of ha'etz versus ha'adama. There is a dispute about how we define a tree with regard to brachot and saying a ha'etz beforehand. Either if it is that the root stock stays there year after year and you don't have to replant it and it keeps on producing. That's one definition of an eitz. And the other is that it has a woody stem above ground that remains year after year. And so what's the practical difference between them? Pineapples and bananas. Right, because both pineapples and bananas, as we know, do produce year after year, but they are outside the category of ha'etz because the trunk dies and goes dormant between the seasons. And therefore, it does not fit that second definition of a tree, of an eitz. And for that reason, it is deserving of the bracha of ha'adama. Most of its nutrients come directly from the ground every year. And so too, pineapples and bananas and anything which is a ha'adama is not going to be subject to Orlah. And so something that grows on a stem like a strawberry is not subject to Orlah. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about berries next week, because the berry bush is, like we've mentioned, blueberries and raspberries. Are those subject to Orlah or not? That's a little bit more complicated. We're going to look at some mishnayot about that sort of show that berries are a little bit on the line. And there might be a difference between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz, because Orlah in Eretz Yisrael is different than Orlah in Chutz La'aretz. But we're going to now talk a little bit about the similarities between Orlah in Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz, and then we'll get to some of the differences. Okay, so let's go directly to the Mishnah that addresses this issue of the similarities and differences between Orlah in Israel and outside of Israel. So the Mishnah in Kiddushin, and source number 6, says, Kol mitzvah shehi tluya ba'aretz eina noheget ela ba'aretz. Right? Any mitzvah that is dependent on the land. We gave examples before, like Shemitah and Ma'asrot and Trumot. Eina noheget ela ba'aretz. It only applies to produce that comes out of the soil of Israel. V'she'ena tluya ba'aretz noheget bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. And any mitzvah which is not dependent on the land is going to be applicable everywhere, regardless of geography. Chutz, except the following mitzvot. There are 3, or 2 or 3. Min ha'orla v'kilayim. So both orla and kilayim, which is forbidden mixtures between plants and grains and vegetables and grapes, when they're planted too close together or even grafted, right? That applies not just in Israel, but also outside of Israel. And Rabbi Eliezer Omer Af HaChadash, also with regard to eating from the new crop before the Korban HaOmer was brought, is something that applies also outside of Israel. Okay, so these are the 3 exceptions to the general principle of mitzvot that are land dependent are going to only apply in the Holy Land. So we have to ask ourselves, on what grounds are these exceptions made? Why is there this unique class of mitzvot that is really dependent upon the land of Israel, and nevertheless it is not constrained by, or it is not limited to, stuff that is grown in the state of Israel, or in the land of Israel, we could call it. The state of Israel is a different entity, overlapping but not the same as Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so the Gemara is going to dig into this exact question of on what grounds is Orlah an exception? How can it both be dependent and independent of the land of Israel? How can it have that hybrid sort of dual identity? So the Gemara asks, "My tluya umay she'ena tluya." I'm going to try to point along with the cursor here in the Hebrew. I'll translate as I go along, and the English is on the left side if you prefer to follow along in that. So my tluya umay she'ena tluya. So what does it mean that the mitzvot are dependent, and what does it mean that the mitzvot are not dependent? What's the distinguishing factor to group one into one category and one into another? Ilema tluya dichtiv babi'ah, v'she'ena tluya delo ketiv babi'ah. If you want to say that the mitzvot that are tluyot ba'aretz, that depend on the land, are introduced with that introduction of b'chitavo el haaretz, right? When you come to the land after Yehoshua brings you to the land of Israel, that's when these mitzvot will apply. There is a whole class of mitzvot that are directly in that category. And when that introductory frame is not provided, that's considered something which is not dependent on the land of Israel. When we're taught about the list of kosher animals, it makes no mention of v'chitavo el haaretz. There is no prerequisite of being present in the land for that. Hence, it would apply even elsewhere, right? So maybe that's the distinction between them. V'harei, but that distinction doesn't hold because we have some mitzvot that defy that distinction. V'harei tefillin upeter chamor. We have examples of two, but there are many more mitzvot like tefillin and the redeeming of a firstborn of a donkey. Dichtiv bahen bi'ah, where it says there v'chitavo el haaretz, that gives that introductory frame. V'nohagin ban bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz, and we know that tefillin applies everywhere, regardless of where a man might find himself. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore, that distinction of v'chitavo el haaretz cannot be the distinguishing factor. So what does distinguish between the mitzvot that are only applicable in Israel and the ones that are applicable even elsewhere? So Amar Rabbi Yehuda hachi ka'amar, kol mitzvah shehi chovat haguf noheget bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. Any commandment which is person-centered, which the obligation is on the human person, and it is embodied, it is something that is on the gavra, on the person, it applies regardless of where that person might be, whether that person resides in Israel or outside of Israel. Chovat karka, however, something which is something which is determined based on the status of the soil. Eina noheget ela ba'aretz. Something which is contingent upon the place is going to be restricted by that place. Okay, it's a pretty, I think, clean distinction between the types of mitzvot that are on a person and the types of mitzvot that are on a place. Now, of course, there is going to be some intersection of these two because the mitzvot that are dependent upon the land, right, require a person to be there in order for that to be in play. But the fundamental obligation of Shemitah is Shmitat Haaretz. Just to give an example, it's about letting the land lay fallow for the 7th year, regardless of whether there is a person there to abide by those mitzvot. The land itself has to lie fallow. Okay, I see a question in the chat. Okay, Peter Chamor is the body of an animal. That is when you redeem the firstborn of a donkey. So that's not land dependent. It's independent from the land, and it's more dependent on the owner of that donkey. So that's how both tefillin is an obvious example of something which is a chovat haguf, whereas a petar chamor is one step removed because it's not a person on their body, but it's their property, which we consider to be an extension of a person's body. Okay, does that answer the question, Hannah? I hope so. Okay. So here we see in this source that the distinction between mitzvot hatzliot ba'aretz, mitzvot she'ein hatzliot ba'aretz are dependent on the fundamental obligation. Is it based on the person or based on the place? So with that in mind, where does Orlah fall in that distinction? Which bucket would we put it into? Is it a chovat haguf or a chovat hakarka?
Chovat haguf.
So we need to try and say that in order for it to make sense that it would apply outside of Israel. But intuitively, is Orlah something that is land dependent or not land dependent? That's the challenge that we have, which is that the simple, straightforward understanding of Orlah is that when you come to the land and you plant a fruit tree in the soil and the soil gives forth fruit, that fruit cannot be eaten, right? So of course it cannot be eaten by a person, but it would seem to originate in chovat karka. So how can it be something which is both the chovat karka and chovat haguf? That's the work that we have to do, conceptually speaking, in order to justify the obligation of Orlah outside of the land of Israel. Okay. And so Chana is raising another great question about Orlah on hydroponics. Would it apply if it's not in the ground? And the answer is no. It specifically needs to be something which, if I go back to the original source, I'll scroll up where it says unitatem. Nitatem means to plant in the ground. So from that word, we see the scope to be limited to seeds that are put directly in the soil, to the exclusion of both hydroponics and potted plants. So the fig tree that I have so far, which is growing on my porch, is in a big is in a big pot, and it is separate from the ground. And we'll see there's a distinction between if let's say I put a pot on the ground, right? Right now it's on my deck, so it's separate. If it's on the ground but still in a pot, then it's going to depend on whether there's a hole at the bottom. It's a perforated pot, and the roots can go through, and the water can go through both directions. Then it would be subject to Orlah, and if not, then it would not be subject to Orlah. But it's very hard to grow something without a perforated bottom, because if it doesn't drain well, the roots will rot. So that's a pro tip for gardening as well. Okay, so based on our analysis so far, the pasuk would indicate that Orlah does not apply outside of Israel, and the Gemara in Kedushin would also indicate that it does not apply outside of Israel, based on the distinction of chovat haguf and chovat hakarka. But the Mishnah itself said that Orlah was an exception. So what is this exception based on? If it's not based on the conceptual difference between the chovat haguf and the chovat hakarka, what is it based on? So the Gemara continues on the next daf. I have it here in source number 7. On Kedushin Lamed Chet Amud Bet. And we'll take it from the second line over here, where the Gemara says Orlah. I'll just show you with my cursor here. Orlah is halacha v'hakilayim midivrei sofrim. So it distinguishes that even though Orlah and kilayim both make it to the same list of things that apply even outside the land of Israel, they are on different levels of commandedness outside the land of Israel. Orlah is considered to be halacha. We're going to leave that undefined for now. And kilayim is midivrei sofrim. Midivrei sofrim means that it's rabbinic in origin, that the rabbis instituted this as an extension of kilayim in Eretz Yisrael, but it is not a biblical commandment. So now the Gemara asks, my halacha, what does this mean that Orlah is halacha outside the land of Israel? That's sort of a nebulous term. What's the significance of that term from a legal standpoint? So Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Amar Shmuel, Hilchata Medina. So it means, and Rashi says this explicitly here, that the countries, it became the custom of the countries outside of Israel to adopt this minhag. Okay, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, Orlah made it to the list of things applying outside the land of Israel, not even on a rabbinic level, but on a customary level, right? And a custom is on if we're going to create a tiered system of obligation, right? Something which is of a biblical midoraita would be a top tier, midorabanan would be a second tier, midivrei sofrim, that is, would be a second tier, and something which is minhag would be a third tier. Now, of course, there's interplay between all of those tiers, but they are conceptually distinct, and the difference between them is when we have a doubtful situation, right? When you go into a store and you don't know where the fruit comes from, if there is a biblical commandment that is at stake, that is being risked, then you don't buy anything. If there's a rabbinic commandment, then usually we would rule leniently and say a safek derabanan lekula, to allow you to buy that fruit. Whereas if it's just a minhag, then the conversation doesn't even start. That if there's any doubtful situation, then you would not hesitate to buy that fruit. However, Rabbi Yehuda is not the only opinion here, and his opinion is actually rejected. Ula, who is after him, is the mainstream. He says, Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha leMoshe miSinai, that the law of Orlah applying outside the land of Israel is something that was whispered into Moshe's ear on Har Sinai, that was not written down in the Torah Shebe'al Peh. It was not in the Torah Shebichtav either, of course. It wasn't in the Chamishe Chumshei Torah, but it also was not written formally in the Torah Shebe'al Peh, but it is oral tradition that has been preserved. So what is the status of halacha leMoshe miSinai? So that itself is a topic unto its own right, but for now we will say that halacha Moshe miSinai is typically understood, at least by the Rambam and by most of the Rishonim, to have the same force as biblical law. So it would belong in tier 1 with other biblical laws. And here we have something fascinating which emerges, which is that Orlah outside the land of Israel is on a biblical level, even though the pasuk seems to say that it's a mitzvah that depends on the land of Israel. And the Gemara says that we distinguish between a chovat haguf and a chovat hakarka. And the Orlah would more intuitively fit into chovat karka that would not apply outside the land of Israel. Nevertheless, there is a special tradition that Orlah applies even outside the land of Israel on a biblical level. And that's an amazing place to land, because it's more stringent than a lot of the commandments that are land dependent in Israel today, like Shemitah. Shemitah, the Bayom Hazeh, during our contemporary times, is only rabbinic in nature because it requires all of the Jews to be living in the land of Israel in order for it to be of a biblical magnitude. But Orlah in Sharon, Massachusetts is a tier 1, mitzvah, whereas Shemitah in Eretz Yisrael is a tier 2 mitzvah, right? So there's a fascinating sort of irony there, that in some ways, Orlah is going to be a more serious prohibition outside the land of Israel than some of the land-dependent mitzvot in Israel. Okay. So I want to spend a few minutes now trying to understand philosophically how it is that Orlah could be something which would be relevant to people outside the land of Israel in the same way that it's relevant to people inside the land of Israel. So for this, we're going to read our last source for tonight, which is the Ramban, Nachmanides, who I believe was struggling with this question and uncharacteristically provides 3 different reasons behind the mitzvah of Orlah in general, which are not land specific, but are more person-based. And I think he is speaking to the conundrum that we have of trying to justify the fact that Orlah makes it to this list in the Mishnah and Kiddushin of something that applies outside the land of Israel, when it really, based on all of its other characteristics, belongs in the category of things that only apply in the land of Israel. Any comments or questions before we start this last source? Okay, feel free to chime in at any point. So we'll look at this Ramban, and we'll conclude with this source. So the Ramban says in source number 9, V'tam ha-mitzvah hazot, the reason for this mitzvah, lechabed et Hashem mireshit kol tevuatenu, is to honor God with first of all of our fruits, mipri ha'etz, specifically from the fruit trees, v'tvuat ha'kerem. Right, Orlah applies also to grapes and fruit. There's we haven't spoken too much about grapes, even though it's not really a tree. It's more of a vine. It does apply to grapes as well. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week when we break apart the different categories for berries. And we cannot eat from them until we have brought a proper gift to the Creator, a celebratory gift to Hashem, gives us the license to enjoy fruit. So if it is like the first fruits, then it seems to be overlapping with the mitzvah of bikurim, right? And indeed, in the underline over here, at the Ramban says explicitly, "V'hamitzvah hazot domeh lamitzvat habikurim." It's very much akin to the mitzvot that on Shavuot we are meant to bring the first fruits from the Shivat Haminim, but Bikurim is specifically something that depends on the fruit growing in Eretz Yisrael. That is a classic mitzvah hatluya ba'aretz. But Orlah goes beyond that, because Orlah requires this even for fruits growing outside the land of Israel. And so the Ramban says that why do we have to wait 3 years from a fruit tree before bringing the produce to the land of Israel to eat it, right? Or really not to the land of Israel, but the 4th year. I should just back up a quick second to the pasuk that we started with to show you that although the first 3 years are forbidden from eating, the 4th year is only allowed to be eaten in a specific location. In source 4 in Pasuk Chaf Daled, it says Ubeshana HaRevi'it, in the 4th year of all fruit trees, Yihiyeh Kol Piryo, all of the produce is Kodesh Hilulim LaHashem, is meant to be set aside for a celebratory eating together with Hashem, and that takes place in Yerushalayim, right? The farmers would bring that entire crop from the 4th year to Yerushalayim to eat it there. And Mark mentioned at the beginning that sometimes fruit trees can be overwhelming because all of the fruit becomes ripe around the same time and you have too much, you don't know what to do with. So they would bring it to Yerushalayim and they would share it with people, and it became a fruit festival. The 4th year of their fruit harvest was something that was brought to the old city, which provided for the economy in the old city. And of course, if you were living in Haifa or in Yaffo and you had those, grand Yaffo Jaffa oranges, right? How are you going to bring your entire 4th year harvest to Yerushalayim? You couldn't. So what would you do? You would sell it in the port of Yaffo, and you would take the money, and that money would have the kedusha of the Orlah, or of it's really at the 4th year, it's called Neta Revai, the plantings of the 4th year, which is an extension of Orlah. And then you would use that money to buy that, to spend all of it in Yerushalayim and eat there with your friends and family and any stranger. Okay, so that's what the Ramban is referencing when he says that Orlah is like Bikurim, but we have to wait until the 4th year. And here he says something agriculturally based. I'm not going to read it inside, but he says that the first 3 years of a fruit-bearing tree, the produce is really shvach. It's not good quality. He says that the taste isn't good, the smell isn't good, the size isn't good, that you really don't get proper, lush, delicious, fruit until the 4th year, right? The 4th year of a fruit tree producing fruit is going to be when it reaches top quality. And so if we're going to be giving gratitude to Hashem for the magic of being able to grow fruit, then we should wait until that fruit is proper and dignified and something worthy of celebration and showing off. Because especially once we've reached that stage when the fruit is so plump and delicious, that's when we feel perhaps the most amount of arrogance of look what I accomplished, look what I did. The kocham ve'otzam yadi, my produce. And so we need to rectify that by bringing it to Yerushalayim. So that's the first reason that the Ramban gives, that Orlah is really like Bikurim. It's about gratitude. It has little to do with the land, and again, more to do with the person and the character and the attitude that that person cultivates. The second reason, Emet hadavar od, ki hapri b'tchilat mitziat ha'ilanot, rov halachot davek ma'od, mazik laguf ve'enenu tov la'ochla kedag she'en lo kaskeset. Here the Ramban pulls a fascinating move where he says the fruit in the first 3 years is unhealthy. It is bad for digestion. It's harmful for the body. It's not good to eat it. It's like fish that has no scales, which the Torah forbids because it's bad for the body. So if it is unhealthy to eat the fruit in the first 3 years, is that something that applies to the land or to people? It applies to people. So I think here again, the Ramban is choosing a reason that justifies the placement of Orlah to be a chovat haguf, which would justify the Gemara's rationale for placing in that category of applying even outside the land of Israel. And finally, the third reason that the Ramban gives, I'll just read this in English because it'll go a little bit faster, but he quotes the Moreh Nevuchim of the Rambam, where he says that the reason for Orlah is in order to wean people off idolatrous practices and witchcraft at the time of planting trees, because people would often try to offer the early fruits up to their idols in order to gain some sort of leverage or upper hand with the fruit gods, such that their fruit would be, generative and bountiful. And so in order to sort of counter that idolatrous practice, the Orlah was given so that we don't have any benefit from that fruit and we don't do anything with it that could even smack of anything idolatrous. So the prohibition prevents us from rubbing up against idolatry. Okay, so again, that's another attempt clearly to demonstrate that the rationale behind Orlah is person-based and not place-based. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the source sheet as the hour is now 9 o'clock, and just give a summary of what we covered and accomplished tonight. We asked the meta categorical question about how it's possible for Orlah to be an exception and to have this dual identity of both being dependent on the land and applying outside the land of Israel. And we answered by trying to demonstrate that it has the qualities of both a chovat haguf and a chovat hakarka. And we saw that the Ramban provides us a few different rationales that justify that dual categorization. The bottom line is that the mitzvah does apply even in Sharon, Massachusetts, in the same way that it applies in Zichron Yaakov and Tel Aviv and Yerushalayim. But next week, we are going to talk about the most important difference between that, because even though both of them apply on a biblical level, the same tier of mitzvah, nevertheless, the case of safek, of when there is a doubt about Orlah, is going to be different. In Eretz Yisrael, we're going to go lechumra, and the Halacha Moshe Sinai says that in Chutz La'aretz, if there's a case of safek, we go lekula. And that's going to generate a lot of practical differences between cases of uncertainty in Sharon, Massachusetts, versus Ramat HaSharon in the land of Israel. Any comments or questions on what we covered tonight? Yeah, Aaron.
So on the 4th year from Sharon, you have to fly to Israel.
That's a good question. So if you buy me a ticket, I'll fly with you. But one of the differences between Orlah and Chutz La'aretz and Orlah and Eretz Yisrael is that Neta Revai in Chutz La'aretz does not apply to fruit, but it does apply to grapes. So we're not going to talk too much about Kerem Revai. That's a little bit of a different topic, but Masechet Orlah does say that the Neta Revai in the 4th year from Chutz La'aretz does not apply. So if you were looking for an excuse to have to fly to Israel, you'll have to find another excuse.
So what do you do with the fruit on the 1st year? Can you eat it, or you have to wait for the 5th?
So you have to wait for the 5th. So
what do
exactly?
You do with the fruit?
So what do you do with that? What do you do with that? So what did I do with my plum this year? That grew in the 2nd year. So I was planning to bury it because I didn't want anyone to get any benefit from it. But I had a little bit of a breach, and some deer got through my fencing, and so nature had its way. And that deer enjoyed that peach, that plum, I mean. So that was min hashamayim. Everyone won. Mark.
So if it wasn't for the Mishnah carving out the exception, is there any other reason that we would think that Orlah would be different than other agricultural laws? It seems that it's only from that exception carved out in the Mishnah, because the structure of the text in the Torah makes, because it makes it very parallel to Bikurim would say, yes, of course, why, if you're outside, if you're Chutz La'aretz, you don't have the same linkage to coming to Yerushalayim in the fourth year. So so it seems like there's only one place and that's the mission that sort of sets the whole argument in that direction.
Exactly. And that's why we had to work so hard in the Gemara to justify that, because it doesn't seem to be defensible from a category standpoint. It would more intuitively be a mitzvah hatliya ba'aretz. Yeah, David.
And so it sounds like this requirement is independent of who owns the tree or who owns the land that it's planted on. Is that right?
So in the land of Israel, so the answer is no. It depends, because we are defining it as both a chovat haguf and a chovat hakarka. The role of the guf, of the person, matters. So a non-Jew who has an orchard in Israel does not have to worry about Orlah. In the same way that a Jew in America who plants a fruit tree does have to worry about Orlah, because the person, it leans in the direction of being a person-based mitzvah. So the owner is very significant, right? More significant than the place of the fruit tree. Which
The non-Jewish owner is here in Sharon?
I'm sorry, so if it's a non-Jewish owner here in Sharon, then there is no obligation of Orlah at all.
For them or for us?
Both.
Wow, okay.
Because the pasuk says unitatem, that when you plant, right? So if the act of planting, which is understood to mean even if you have a gardener who does the planting on your behalf, it's still considered an extension of your behavior. If you own it, then the Orlah would apply. But when we go to Ward's Berry Farm and you see there's a new row of fruit trees, you don't have to worry about Orlah because it's non-Jewish owned. So it's very specific to the person who owns the fruit tree. Okay, wonderful. Well, it was so good to study together. I wish you a Laila Tov. And next week, at the same place, the same time, we'll continue to get into some more of the specifics about how to calculate the Orlah calendar for a specific tree. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the assorted halachot as well, of berries, and about when there's a ta'arovet, when there's a mixture of Orlah and non-Orlah, what's the ratio in which it's nullified, and we'll take it from there. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank
Laila
you.
Tov.
Thank you. Laila Tov.